The conference room door burst open, and it wasn't the CEO, wasn't HR, it was the CEO's wife who walked in. In her hand was a pre-printed termination letter, placed directly in front of me. No explanation, just one cold statement, effective immediately. In that moment, I understood better than anyone in that room. She wasn't just stealing the $85,000 bonus I'd earned after a year of blood and sweat, but had unknowingly lit the fuse on a legal bomb buried deep in the company's contracts for over a decade. A bomb only I knew how to detonate, and when it exploded, $190 million would vanish in just 4 emails. My name is Claire Donovan, and for 17 years, I was the invisible backbone of Aurelius Tech. At 38, I'd spent nearly half my life writing the code that kept this company breathing. But on that Tuesday morning at 10:45 a.m., Elena Caro decided I was disposable. She stood there in her designer suit, manicured nails tapping against the termination letter she'd just placed on the conference table. The fluorescent lights caught her wedding ring, a massive diamond that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Behind her, 2 security guards waited like trained dogs, ready to escort me out. "Your access has been revoked," Elena said, her voice carrying that particular brand of corporate cruelty masked as professionalism. "Security will accompany you to collect your personal items. You have 15 minutes. I didn't move. Instead, I looked past her to the glass walls of the conference room, where my team people I'd mentored, trained, protected, avoided eye contact. They knew what was happening. They knew it was wrong. But Elena Caro wasn't just the CEO's wife. She was the shadow power behind Victor Caro's throne, and crossing her meant career suicide. "May I ask why?" I kept my voice steady, though my mind was already racing through calculations. 72 hours until my annual bonus would hit, $85,000 that I'd already earned through metrics, through performance reviews that exceeded every target. Elena's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Restructuring. Your position has been eliminated." Restructuring. The corporate equivalent of, because I said so. We both knew the truth. The next-gen acquisition, a $190 million deal, was set to close next week. My name was all over the technical due diligence documents. My systems architecture was the crown jewel they were selling. But having me in the picture meant sharing credit, meant acknowledging that Victor Caro hadn't built this technology empire I had, alongside the original founders who were long gone. "I see." I stood slowly, gathering my laptop, my notebook, the coffee mug my daughter had painted for me in 3rd grade that read, "World's Best Mom," in crooked letters, and my pending bonus. "Forfeited. You're no longer an employee as of..." She glanced at her phone. 10:47 a.m. The bonus requires active employment status through end of fiscal year. 72 hours. She'd calculated it down to the minute. The security guard stepped forward, flanking me like I was some kind of criminal. As we walked through the open office floor, I saw the knowing looks, the guilty glances. Everyone knew what Elena had done. The annual bonuses were sacred at Aurelius, written into our contracts as deferred compensation. It wasn't just money, it was recognition, validation, proof that our sacrifices meant something. But what Elena didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her corporate career. Hidden in subsection 12.4 of my original employment contract, a clause that Richard Hale, our paranoid genius founder, had insisted on adding, a clause that had been grandfathered through 3 acquisitions and 2 restructures, a clause that was about to turn Elena's power play into a $200 million disaster. As the elevator descended, I pulled out my personal phone and opened my banking app. The countdown had already begun. 71 hours, 58 minutes, 32 seconds, until the automatic transfer would fail to process, until the intellectual property rights to our core encryption architecture would revert to the last documented architect of record. Me. Elena Caro had just fired the wrong person at the wrong time, and in 72 hours, she'd understand exactly how wrong she'd been. 17 years. That's how long I'd given to Aurelius Tech. Though back in 2008, it wasn't even called that. We were just data vault systems, 8 engineers crammed into a converted warehouse in Palo Alto, surviving on ramen and venture capital fumes. I was 21, fresh out of MIT, the only woman on the engineering team, Richard Hale had recruited me personally after seeing my thesis on adaptive encryption protocols. "You think differently," he'd said over coffee at a dingy cafe near campus. "We need different—" Those early days were brutal and beautiful. 18-hour coding marathons fueled by Red Bull and pure adrenaline. I remember the night we almost lost everything, a massive DDoS attack at 3:20 a.m. that could have destroyed our first major client's data. While everyone else panicked, I dove into the code, rewrote our entire defense architecture on the fly, and saved not just the data, but the company itself. Richard never forgot that night. A week later, he called me into his office, really just a corner of the warehouse with a desk made from a door and 2 sawhorses. He slid a revised contract across to me. "Read section 12.4, he said, lighting his 3rd cigarette of the morning despite California's indoor smoking laws. The clause was unusual, almost paranoid. If I completed 5 continuous years of service and received my full performance bonus each year, the intellectual property rights to any core architecture I developed would have a reversionary clause. If the company terminated me without cause within 72 hours of a bonus payment, those rights would revert to me." "Why?" I'd asked. Richard exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "Because talent like yours shouldn't be disposable, and because I've seen too many founders and architects get screwed by suits who show up after the hard work's done." Prophetic words. By 2012, we'd grown to 200 employees. My encryption architecture had become the backbone of our platform, processing millions of transactions daily. When the 2014 financial sector hack hit our competitors, we were the only ones left standing. My code had held the line. The acquisition offers started rolling in. Richard fought them off until 2016 when his cancer diagnosis changed everything. Victor Caro's investment group offered $800 million. Richard took it, but not before ensuring that every original employee's contract would be honored in perpetuity. "They'll try to push you out eventually," Richard told me from his hospital bed. 2 weeks before he died. "Victor's not an engineer. He's a vampire in a suit. But that clause, that's your insurance policy. Don't let them steal what you built." I'd built everything. The multi-layered encryption that made us unhackable. The distributed architecture that let us scale infinitely. The proprietary algorithms that our competitors spent millions trying to reverse engineer. Every time we landed a Fortune 500 client, it was my code they were buying. But I stayed in the shadows, content to be the architect while Victor played CEO. I watched him take credit in TechCrunch interviews, saw him accept innovation awards for systems he couldn't even explain. I endured it because the work mattered more than the recognition. Then Elena arrived, Victor's 3rd wife, 28 years old with an MBA from Wharton and a hunger that made her husband look satisfied. She started small, reorganizing departments, installing her sorority sisters in key positions, but her eyes were always on the bigger prize, the next-gen acquisition that would net them personally over $50 million in stock options. My presence complicated their narrative. Every due diligence meeting required my expertise. Every technical review highlighted that Claire Donovan, not Victor Caro, was the mastermind behind Aurelius Tech's success. Last month, I overheard Elena on a call. "She's a liability to the acquisition storyline. NextGen wants to buy Victor's vision, not some developer's code." Some developer, 17 years reduced to 2 words. Standing in my empty apartment after security escorted me out, I pulled up the original contract on my laptop, the one I'd scanned and stored in 3 different cloud services, the one with Richard Hale's signature next to mine. Section 12.4 glowed on the screen like a beacon. Elena thought she was eliminating a problem. Instead, she just activated a 17-year-old insurance policy that was about to pay out in ways she couldn't imagine. Victor Caro wasn't a builder, he was a buyer. When his investment group acquired Aurelius Tech in 2016, he'd never written a line of code, never pulled an all-nighter to fix a critical bug, never felt the satisfaction of watching elegant architecture handle millions of requests flawlessly. He was the kind of man who believed that money could purchase expertise, that ownership papers meant understanding. I'd first met him during the acquisition negotiations. He'd walked into our conference room wearing a suit worth more than most engineers' monthly salaries, flanked by lawyers and investment bankers, while Richard Hale fought for employee protections. Victor kept checking his Patek Philippe watch, as if our life's work was keeping him from something more important. The technology is solid, he'd said, like he could judge what he couldn't comprehend. But the company needs professional management. Professional management, that's what he called replacing our CTOs with his Harvard Business School buddies, none of whom could distinguish between Python and JavaScript. Within 6 months, 3 of our best engineers had quit. I stayed because Richard asked me to, because he was dying and needed to know his legacy would survive. But Victor alone might have been manageable. He was content to play CEO, to give keynotes at conferences, reading from scripts I'd technically reviewed. The real poison entered our ecosystem when Elena appeared. I remember their wedding announcement in 2019, a TechCrunch puff piece that made me physically ill. Power couple tech CEO Victor Caro marries strategy consultant Elena Morrison. The article gushed about her Stanford MBA, her fresh perspective on technical innovation, her plans to streamline Aurelius Tech's operations. Elena was 28, hungry, and smart in all the wrong ways. Where Victor was satisfied with appearing successful, Elena wanted to be feared. She started attending engineering meetings, asking questions designed not to learn, but to establish dominance. She'd challenge architectural decisions with buzzwords gleaned from Medium articles, forcing us to waste hours explaining why her innovative blockchain solution wouldn't work for our database infrastructure. Claire doesn't appreciate modern thinking. I heard her tell Victor one evening when they thought the office was empty. I was in the server room, running maintenance hands-on work the executives never bothered with. "She's been here forever," Victor replied. "Knows where all the bodies are buried." "That's exactly the problem," Elena said. "The next-gen deal needs a clean narrative. David versus Goliath. The visionary CEO who transformed a small startup into an empire, not some programmer who happened to be here from the beginning. Some programmer, like I hadn't architected the very systems that made the next-gen acquisition possible." Elena's campaign against me was subtle at first. My name disappeared from company presentations. My technical reports were suddenly too detailed for board meetings. She restructured reporting so I no longer had direct access to Victor, instead routing everything through her hand-picked VP of engineering, a man who once asked me if we could download more RAM to improve server performance. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. NextGen's technical team had questions about our core encryption deep, specific questions that only I could answer. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. At 1:45 p.m., Elena informed me I wouldn't be attending. "We need to present a unified leadership front," she said, standing in my office doorway like she owned it. "Victor will handle the technical discussion." I watched from my desk as the meeting imploded. Victor stumbled through explanations, confused authentication with authorization, claimed our encryption was military grade without understanding what that meant. By 3:30 p.m., NextGen was threatening to reduce their offer by $30 million. I saved it, of course, sent a detailed technical document directly to NextGen's CTO that night, bypassing Elena entirely. The deal was back on track by morning, but Elena knew I'd undermined her. That's when she decided I had to go. The termination timing wasn't random. Elena had done her homework sort of. She knew about the bonus, knew that firing me 72 hours before it paid out would save the company $85,000. What she didn't know was that she'd studied the wrong contract. She'd reviewed the standard employment agreement, the one HR used for everyone hired after the acquisition, but I wasn't on that contract. I was still on my original 2008 agreement, the one Richard Hale had personally crafted, the one with provisions that no corporate lawyer would ever approve today. Elena Caro thought she was eliminating an $85,000 expense and a threat to her narrative. Instead, she'd just triggered a clause that would make her the most expensive mistake in Aurelius Tech's history. Back in my apartment, I pulled up the system dashboard on my personal laptop, the one they couldn't revoke access to because I'd built it outside their infrastructure. A countdown timer filled the screen, 71 hours, 12 minutes, 18 seconds, until the automatic bonus transfer would fail. The beauty of Richard Hale's paranoia was in the details. Section 12.4 of my contract wasn't just about intellectual property, it was a masterpiece of legal engineering. If the company terminated me without cause within 72 hours of a scheduled performance bonus, 2 things would happen. First, all intellectual property rights for systems I'd architected would immediately revert to me. Not after a legal battle, not pending arbitration immediately, automatically, irreversibly. Second, and this was Richard's genius, the company would have exactly 0 hours to notify any pending acquisition partners of this material change in asset ownership. I opened another document, the next-gen acquisition agreement I'd helped review last month. My fingers found Section 14.2, the Key Personnel Continuity Clause. I'd flagged as unusual. NextGen had insisted that certain technical leads remain with the company through the transition. My name was listed first. But there was more. Section 21.8, buried in the Technical Assets Schedule, specifically identified our core encryption architecture as critical intellectual property valued at $68 million, the same architecture that, in 71 hours, would belong to me. My phone buzzed, a text from James Park, my former deputy. "Claire, what happened? Elena just announced you're gone. This is insane." I didn't reply. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Instead, I opened my email client, not the corporate one, but my personal Gmail. I began drafting 4 emails, each one carefully crafted, each one scheduled to send at precisely calculated intervals. The first email was to Morrison Blake, NextGen's Chief Legal Officer. Simple, professional. "Dear Mr. Blake, I'm writing to inform you of my recent separation from Aurelius Tech, effective 10:47 a.m. today. As you're aware, I'm listed as key personnel in Section 14.2 of your acquisition agreement. I thought you should be informed directly. Best regards, Claire Donovan." I scheduled it to send in 68 hours. The second email was to Sandra Walsh, the Wall Street Journal reporter who'd interviewed me 3 years ago about women in tech architecture. She'd given me her direct email, said to reach out if I ever had a story worth telling. "Sandra, you might want to ask Aurelius Tech about their key personnel continuity clause and why their lead architect was terminated 72 hours before a vested bonus payment. Timeline might interest you. Scheduled for 69 hours. The third email would go to Aurelius Tech's board of directors, all 9 of them, including 2 who'd quietly expressed concerns about Elena's growing influence. Board members, at 12:47 p.m. on Friday, the intellectual property rights to Aurelius Tech's core encryption architecture will revert to my ownership per Section 12.4 of my employment contract, triggered by wrongful termination within 72 hours of a vested bonus. This affects approximately $68 million in stated assets in the next-gen acquisition. Legal documentation attached. 70 hours. The fourth email was the kill shot. It would go to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, with copies to our 3 biggest competitors and the tech press. Notice of ownership transfer patent numbers US 9834521B2, US 9834522B2, US 9834523B2, and 14 related patents will transfer from Aurelius Tech to Claire Donovan, individual, at 12:47 p.m. Pacific Time on Friday. Reversionary clause documentation attached. New licensing inquiries welcome. 72 hours, exactly. I leaned back, watching the countdown timer tick down. Elena thought she'd won by denying me $85,000. But she'd forgotten the first rule of war: never strike an enemy unless you're certain they can't strike back. In the original employment contract, Richard had included one more provision I hadn't mentioned to anyone, not even to him before he died. If the reversionary clause triggered, I wouldn't just own the existing patents, I'd own all derivative works, all improvements, all updates made to the core architecture. 5 years of upgrades, 3 major version releases, the entire technical foundation of a $190 million acquisition. Elena Caro had just made me the most powerful person in this acquisition. She just didn't know it yet. The countdown continued 70 hours, 58 minutes, 43 seconds. I smiled and opened a bottle of wine. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't about anger or confrontation. It was about patience, precision, and letting your enemies destroy themselves with their own arrogance. In 70 hours, Elena would understand that some programmers were worth more than she could possibly imagine. The first ripple started exactly as planned. 68 hours after my termination, at 6:47 a.m. Pacific Time, Morrison Blake opened his email over morning coffee in New York. By 6:52 a.m., he was on the phone with NextGen's CEO. By 7:15 a.m., an emergency conference call was assembled. I knew because James Park was feeding me updates. He hadn't forgotten who'd hired him, who'd trained him, who'd protected him from Elena's purges. "Legal is freaking out," he texted. "They're pulling up your personnel file, the acquisition agreement, everything." The second email landed an hour later. Sandra Walsh was nothing if not efficient. By 8:30 a.m. Pacific Time, her editor had approved a rush piece for the online edition. The headline was subtle but devastating. Questions arise about key personnel changes ahead of Aurelius' next-gen deal. She'd done her homework, noting my 17-year tenure, my name on the patents, the suspicious timing of my termination. The story didn't accuse it, just asked questions that Elena couldn't answer without lying. Victor called Elena at 9:43 a.m. I know because she took the call in the parking garage, and security cameras don't lie if you know how to access them remotely. She was pacing, gesturing wildly, her voice echoing off concrete, even though I couldn't hear the words. Her body language told the story: panic, denial, rage. By noon, Aurelius Tech's stock had dropped 4% minor, but enough to trigger automated alerts among institutional investors. The sharks smelled blood. Then came the third email. 70 hours after my termination, the board received my notice about the patent reversions. The beauty was in the timing it arrived during their monthly meeting, the one Elena was supposed to be triumphantly presenting the final acquisition terms to. Roger Chen, the lead independent director, called me directly at 1:20 p.m. "Claire, what the hell is going on?" "Read section 12.4 of my original employment contract," I said calmly. "The one Richard Hale signed, the one your lawyers should have flagged during due diligence. This will kill the acquisition." "That's not my problem anymore. Roger, I was terminated without cause. The contract is clear. Elena says you were part of a restructuring. 72 hours before my bonus vested, my position eliminated, while we're weeks from closing a deal that explicitly requires my continued employment. Come on, Roger, you're smarter than that." Silence. Then, "What do you want?" "Nothing. The contract executes automatically. I checked my timer. 23 hours and 12 minutes. I'll own the core technology. NextGen will walk away because their entire valuation model depends on acquiring those patents. Your market cap will crater. Elena and Victor will be explaining to shareholders how they destroyed $190 million to save $85,000. There must be something. Actually, there is one thing." I let the pause stretch. "You could read the employment documents before letting CEOs' wives fire key personnel. But that's just free advice from a former employee." The fourth email was still waiting, scheduled perfectly for maximum impact, but its threat was already rippling through the system. NextGen's lawyers were dissecting every word of the acquisition agreement. The Wall Street Journal story had been picked up by TechCrunch, Reuters, Bloomberg. My phone had 30